Welcome back, everybody. So, finish up another week of marathon racing, which leads us into this next topic we want to talk about of goal setting, right? So, kind of putting a close to one chapter of your running career, heading into the next. And a lot of times we think about, okay, what's the next step, and what other races and events, things get you excited. But we want to talk a little bit more about having a structure and a bigger picture with that. I know from personal experience, myself and some of my athletes, we're always worried about like this specific race, and if it comes up like, oh, how do I fit even more races into my schedule, right? Instead of thinking, okay, these are all the things that I want to do, how can I make that kind of fit into the bigger training cycle, and how it's going to help me be a better athlete long term, right? We know we can't, like, you want to do, let's say this weekend, like the Chicago Marathon, the Boston Marathon. But it's not always smart, unless you're Shirley Flanagan, I guess, to do them to do them back-to-back days. Yep. So, yes, you want to do both those things, but what's the smartest way to go about it? What's the best way to structure that in life? And I know for you, you've worked with some athletes going to the Olympic trials, and that's like the big goal. And the Olympics sets an easy 4-year window for us, right? So talk a little bit about kind of how do you utilize that with those athletes, and then how can we translate that idea of having this, okay, we have a forced 4-year window to see gains. How can we adapt that to some of our other athletes?
Yeah, I think the biggest things that does is it sort of puts, obviously, a big race on the calendar, and then over the course of that, that date's set, but you can kind of pick those dates that sort of to get qualifiers, to try to punch your ticket, set a couple of plans of, hey, like, we're going to try it here. If not, our backup is here. And then especially with the fact that it's the marathon, a lot of times we aren't going to want to do a marathon that cycle right leading up to the trials marathon too. So it makes us work on something that's normally a complement, working on more speed or sort of that middle range there. So we're not just training for one event the whole way through. It kind of forces us to cycle up and cycle down so we can be in a great spot to be able to run a PR, to be able to run a qualifier, but then be able to do something different to kind of enhance our skills, focus on, if the course is going to be really fast or if the course is going to be really hot or hilly, be able to sort of tailor even 6 months, 8 months out what we're doing for a previous race prep so that we're in the right spot for that big focus. And then it kind of puts us in a nice complete spot where we've done a wide range of training and we're not just sort of a one-pace athlete going into, the big priority race of that 3 or 4 year cycle.
Right, and we talk about like the Olympic trials as like one of these marks that people are going for, but then that trickles down to other events too, and Boston qualifiers are a thing that a lot of athletes are going after, and Boston's this weird cycle where you either have to run something fast in the spring, which for us here in the Midwest can be tough, winter training's challenging, or you have to run something in the fall and know that you're setting yourself up for like 18 months later. And a lot of athletes, I feel like, go into these marathons thinking like, I want to BQ. And think about that BQ in this really narrow window of like this next training cycle. And as we found from this weekend, sometimes like marathon day doesn't turn out to be the best weather-wise. And so much is dictated by what happens on that specific day. You can put in 6 months of high-quality training, be ready to run a certain time, and for whatever reason, weather, your body, nutrition, like things just don't go well. And for some athletes, I feel like they set themselves up to fail almost because they don't think about it as this big window of, hey, in the next 5 years of my running career, I'd like to qualify for Boston. And instead they think of, at Indy, I'm going to qualify for Boston. Or at a specific race, I'm going to qualify for Boston. And if something goes bad that day, like weather-wise, physically, they think of that as a failure. When they've actually done the job that they were supposed to be doing for that training cycle and leading them up for the next training cycle to come to continue going after those goals. So like you had mentioned, having like this big goal out there is like the number one thing that we're shooting for, but then kind of reverse engineering how we're going to get there and being able to take a couple swipes at it, I think is a really, really beneficial way to more so structure the goals. And hey, maybe you have a good day at Chicago or something like that, and you can change things up for the next 18 months, or maybe you're able to rip something at grandma's. That's awesome. But to know going into it that you have this bigger plan seems to be, from my mind and from personal experience, a way to lead to greater success, and for you to be able to see the process in a bigger picture in that kind of good light verse of the negativity that can come with potentially just having an off day on marathon day, which happens. That's why the marathon's so challenging to get a handle on.
Absolutely, yeah. that balance of chasing a goal versus just kind of letting the fitness flow through you. And you've got to take what you're given on a race day, and like you just kind of let everything flow, and then just trust that over the process, if you do the work day by day, eventually those Saturdays or Sundays or Mondays where you're putting on a bib number, it's going to turn out the way you want it to. And knowing that it doesn't take it going perfectly, and that sometimes those things that we learn about a rough marathon day help us to have an even better big day down the road.
Right. And I think that's a big thing, is not always to look at the races, all the negatives, but how can you turn those into positives? Right. Like, yep, Boston was tough. Maybe we needed to work more on the hills, and especially that downhill eccentric loading needs to be part of the training cycle. Maybe that means, I'm biased, but more time in the weight room doing some things that are going to help you attenuate to that force. I think that's a nice tool to be able to use just from a goal setting standpoint of, okay, pick some positives, pick some negatives. Don't dwell on the negatives, but how are those negatives going to be able to turn into positives down the road? Another thing that I feel like having that long-term kind of maybe for me, because I'm in this like Olympic cycle, 4 years like seems to be like, okay, this is what I want to do. I don't know if you have a different like 5, 10, like do you change that cycle, or do you stick with 4 because of that bias?
It really depends. Like we'll sometimes do like sort of those medium length cycles of like 2 to 4 years. But a lot of times like with athletes where we know we want to do some big things, we'll talk sort of 8, 10, 12 years and sort of say, hey, like, what are our big focuses? When do we kind of shift? When do we want to start getting some early experience in that, even when we're still focusing on one endeavor? So like if you want to be in the trail world, but you still want to be chasing those BQs or OTQs, how do we get a chance to sort of dip our toe in the ultra water a little bit, either training wise or racing wise, so that when we make that transition, we're going to be stronger for it. We're going to be a little more prepared for the ultra world, as well as kind of infusing something new and a new challenge into the marathon training that we're doing.
Right. And there's things that we can plan for and things we can't at times too. But like knowing like, okay, are you going to go back to school? Are you going to change jobs? Are you moving? Are you going to start a family or grow your family? Those are pieces that can kind of fit into that puzzle as well.
Right.
To know like, okay, like we've got this career, like, right, 15, 20-year window. And we're going to break those into smaller segments. And maybe in 5 years, you're planning to move. So like we can break it down into that 5 year, because there's going to be a huge stress that's going to change potentially the next 2, 3, 6 months after that. That might change your running. So using things like that to help break up some of those goal segments, I think can really help.
Yeah. And I think kind of identifying the two big sort of limiters that can sometimes, we want to fill the calendar. Like when you're fit, you want to do everything. Being able to identify races where the calendar limits in terms of being able to, maybe do a certain number of halves building up to a full, or doing a couple of different fulls. If you want to do Chicago and New York, and you want to do Lakefront, or you want to go down to 80 or something like that, like you got to spread that out over 3 or 4 years probably.
Right.
So being able to look at that from a calendar perspective, as well as from an energy systems perspective. So there's definitely some sort of goals that we can partner together. If we want to be in great marathon shape, there's a good chance that we can run a very, very solid half on the way to that. It might not be the most specific half training, but we can give you a really good opportunity to chase a high performance mark along the way, versus if we're looking to run a mile PR, might not be the best thing in the world to try to run a really fast half marathon 6 weeks before that.
Yes.
So being able to use that and be able to sort of set the time for like, hey, like I'm going to kind of be focused on this type of event this season, and then be able to, if there's a couple of goals that are more in sort of that shorter, medium distance range, be able to put those together so that we're kind of partnering our skill sets, partnering our training, so that it's sort of focused and complementary to check off as many boxes as we can, as well as we can without overloading our system.
Right. And it lets you kind of couple those things so that you can keep striving. A lot of people are performance and results based. So we can keep striving for some of those performance goals, but stay within the energy system that's going to kind of lead you up to the best opportunity for that. I think it's really, really nice to be able to say, yep, we want the marathon's the big goal. But what else on the either side of that can we use to help give you some other kind of upticks in the training, benefit you from a marathon standpoint, but then also give you those opportunities to go after some PRs along the way. Another thing I feel like I see is, I just keep listing things on and on, so hopefully that's okay, is people get kind of race happy, where they're just like, oh, there's an opportunity to race, so I'm going to go race because racing's fun. And it is fun, but it needs to complement what the goals are, right? Maybe you want to go out and do 70.3 or an Ironman, but then you also want to run a fast marathon. Like, there's a lot of different training that goes into each of those. Even though a marathon's part of both, the training's totally different.
Yeah.
And going through and saying, well, I'm training for this marathon, but I'm going to throw all these triathlons into it isn't always the best way from a training standpoint, but more so from a recovery standpoint to lead you up to that. Because there's a big, I mean, these ultra endurance events and endurance events take a lot out of people from a physiological standpoint, from an emotional standpoint, tissue breakdown, all that. And if you don't give your body the time to recover, you're only taking away from your goals down the road. Right. So even getting happy and getting kind of trigger happy with like, well, there's an opportunity there, so I'm going to go take it.
Yeah.
I love seizing the opportunity, but we've got to seize the opportunity when it's appropriate, not at the expense of our other goals. And we've seen that too, especially when we had the year taken away with 2020, when not a lot of people raced. Like this year has been, I'm going to do anything I can.
Yeah.
And I understand that, and that's okay. But if you go back to the idea of having this larger goal and thinking about goals in years and decades instead of what am I going to do in 2021, that can better frame and lead you to more success at the events that are really most important to you.
Yeah.
Right? Who cares if you go to some 10K someplace and run a great time when the goal is 3 weeks later to run a fast marathon? And if that doesn't line up well, like, and maybe it does, maybe it's part of the plan, but it doesn't always work that well where people are just hopping in races to hop in races.
Yeah. And I think that's the big thing is like we can help direct traffic, talk about those cost benefit situations where if that makes sense to you, and like the little dip in performance we might see if we sort of sacrifice some of that training, some of that recovery, some of that specificity, if that's what's most important to you, we can make that happen and sort of figure out a way to do that as intelligently as possible. But especially we're holistic, we're really long-term oriented. If we really want to say, hey, like, let's not just give you a number of experiences, let's give you great experiences where you feel powerful, where you feel well prepared. If we can do that and we zoom out and take that patient approach so that when you get on the starting line, you're used to feeling like, hey, like I'm ready for this and I know that I can execute, that's what it's all about.
Right. And it's not cookie cutter. And this is going to lead into some other conversations we'll have down the road, but we can't, what we're talking about now isn't set in stone. Like, it's a conversation you have with an athlete. And some athletes get more fulfillment by going to do these events than they do about the time that it takes them to cross the finish line. Right? And that's okay. So for those people, like, yeah, maybe we're going to do more events because that's what gives them most meaning with their running. But a lot of people want the most out of every single event that they do. And that's just not feasible from a physiological standpoint. You're not going to be able to sustain that. So we've got to have that conversation. We got to pick and choose. And maybe you go into a race and you can't hate us when we tell you can't go all out. Like, you're going to run this at a certain progression run, like, because that's what you need. Because you know that 6-8 weeks down the road, you're not going to be able to put in the full effort if you've had all these consistent hits where you're going kind of all the way to the well. Yeah. So it's conversation. It's not cookie cutter, but that's the beauty of the sport, is that there's a lot of art and individualized aspects to it instead of just clicking Control P and taking something off the internet, right?
And that's kind of the nice thing is we get that spot, and this kind of time where, especially if you're at the end of a race right now, or sort of the next time you're wrapping up a training cycle, that sort of downtime when you're not sort of in the midst of sort of that excitement of racing and sort of all that, sort of trigger happy stuff that you were talking about, be able to sort of take some time within yourself and figure out like, hey, what am I most excited about? Like, what lights me up when I get out the door and it's cold and rainy, or it's already dark outside at like 4:15, like it's coming sadly.
It's coming.
What are the big things that you really want to accomplish, and be able to take that space and say, like, let's have a conversation about, let's make this number one. And then let's put those supporting pieces along the way so that we know the roadmap to the journey before we get driving too far.
Yeah. And make sure it's coming from you.
Yeah.
That's the biggest thing, right? Don't listen to anybody else, what they want, but what are you daydreaming about that's an awesome. I stole that one from Thomas too. Just like every single time we're done with a training cycle, take some time, go daydream a little bit, think about what you want to do next, and whatever you're thinking about should drive the next training cycle.
Absolutely.
So awesome. We'll leave it at that. See you guys next time.